This month's payment, Mr. Hargrave. I know it's a few days late, but I've made up the difference.
A woman running a ranch alone? That's not banking, Mrs. Whitfield. That's charity. "30 days, Mrs. Whitfield. Then the bank takes the ranch."
I'm afraid that's not quite accurate, Mr. Hargrove.
Nathaniel Boone. I hold the controlling interest in the Redemption Bank and Trust.
Picture a woman standing at a bank counter, her life's work reduced to a single sheet of paper with 30 days written across it in another man's hand. Now picture, standing near the door behind her, a stranger nobody in that bank had bothered to notice. A man quiet enough to be mistaken for nobody at all, and wealthy enough to own the very bank threatening to take everything she had left. 3 weeks later, the people of Redemption, Kansas, would learn exactly who that stranger was. But before that morning at the counter ever happened, Clara Whitfield had already spent 2 years fighting a battle that had nothing to do with guns, and everything to do with numbers that refused, no matter how hard she worked, to add up in her favor. Clara Whitfield had married Thomas Whitfield 9 years before this story begins, and together they had built the Whitfield Horse Ranch from almost nothing. 40 acres of grassland at the edge of Redemption, Kansas, 2 barns raised board by board with their own hands, and a small herd of quarter horses that Thomas had bred with a patience and skill that had, in time, made the Whitfield name known as far as Wichita. Thomas had died 18 months earlier, thrown from a green colt he'd been gentling in a spring storm, and Clara had buried him on a hillside overlooking the pasture he'd loved, beneath a stone she'd paid for with money that should have gone toward the mortgage. She did not regret it. She simply understood, in the months that followed, that the decision had cost her more than a stone's worth of dollars. She had not sold the ranch, though more than one neighbor had gently suggested it might be easier. Selling would have meant admitting that a woman alone could not do what she and Thomas had done together, and Clara Whitfield was not built for that particular kind of surrender. She kept the ranch running with the help of Amos Riley, an aging hired hand who had worked for Thomas since before Clara had ever set foot in Kansas, and who had simply stayed on after Thomas's death, without ever discussing wages, because, as he put it, somebody's got to mind the horses, and it isn't going to be nobody. Together, the two of them had managed to keep the herd fed, the fences mended, and 3 foals born and raised to sale age over the past year and a half. A genuine accomplishment, by any honest measure, for 2 people running a ranch that had once needed at least 4 hands to manage properly. Clara had learned things in that year and a half she had never expected to learn. How to read a horse's lameness before it worsened into something serious. How to barter feed prices down at the mercantile. How to keep books well enough to know, almost to the penny, what the ranch could and could not afford in any given month. She had become, without quite meaning to, exactly the kind of rancher Thomas had always believed she could be, though she would have given almost anything to have him there to see it. What Clara could not manage, no matter how hard she and Amos worked, was the mortgage. Thomas had taken a loan against the land 3 years back to expand the herd and build the second barn, a loan he had fully intended to pay off within 5 years with the ranch's growing income. His death had interrupted those plans in every possible way, and Clara had spent the past 18 months making partial payments, missing others, and watching the balance owed to the Redemption Bank and Trust grow, rather than shrink, no matter how many horses she sold. The bank was run by a man named Silas Hargrove, who had taken over as head cashier not long after Thomas's death, following the sudden retirement of the previous, considerably gentler bank manager. Silas was young for the position, ambitious, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes to a man who has never once had to ask anyone for anything. He had made it known, in the careful way such things become known in a small town, that he considered the Whitfield mortgage a poor risk that should never have been extended to a widow in the first place, regardless of how well she had managed to keep up with it. That spring, after Clara had missed her second payment in a row, not through any failure of effort, but because a late frost had killed the season's first crop of hay and forced her to buy feed at a price the ranch could barely absorb, Silas Hargrove decided the time had come to settle the matter of the Whitfield mortgage once and for all. He sent no letter of warning. He simply waited until Clara came into town for the monthly payment she had scraped together, penny by penny, from what little the ranch could spare, and prepared, instead, to give her something else entirely. The Redemption Bank and Trust occupied the finest brick building on Main Street, its tall windows catching the morning light in a way that made the modest wooden storefronts around it look smaller than they were. Clara arrived a little before 10 o'clock. Her monthly payment counted twice over and folded carefully into an envelope, dressed in her plainest working clothes, because there had been chores to finish before she could make the 2-mile ride into town. She was not the only customer that morning. 2 ranchers stood near the counter discussing cattle prices, and a young clerk was helping an elderly widow count out coins for a small withdrawal. Clara took her place in line, envelope in hand, rehearsing, as she often did on these visits, the brief and businesslike exchange she hoped to have and be done with. Silas Hargrove was behind the counter himself that morning, rather than leaving the transaction to a clerk, which Clara noted only in passing, without understanding what it meant. He greeted her with the same thin, correct courtesy he always used in public, the kind that never quite reached his eyes, and asked, with apparent politeness, how the ranch was faring, as though he did not already know precisely what her answer would be, and had not, in fact, already decided the answer no longer mattered to him. When her turn came, she stepped forward and placed the envelope on the counter. "This month's payment, Mr. Hargrove. I know it's a few days late. The frost got into the hay crop, but I've made up the difference." Silas did not open the envelope immediately. He studied Clara for a moment instead, in the unhurried way of a man who has already decided how a conversation is going to end and is simply enjoying the walk toward it. "A woman running a ranch alone," he said, pitching his voice just loud enough to be heard by the ranchers nearby, though he kept his tone almost pleasant, almost reasonable. "That's not banking, Mrs. Whitfield. That's charity. And this bank isn't in the business of charity." The 2 ranchers glanced over, and one of them had the decency to look uncomfortable. The elderly widow at the next counter paused her coin counting to listen, her expression sympathetic but careful not to interfere. Clara felt her face grow warm, though she kept her chin level and her voice steady. "I've made every payment I could manage, Mr. Hargrove, and I intend to make every one that's still owed. I'd ask that you count what's in that envelope before you decide what kind of business this bank is in." Silas smiled thinly, opened the envelope, and counted the bills with deliberate slowness, as though the exercise itself were a small punishment. When he finished, he set the money aside and reached instead beneath the counter, producing a folded notice that he placed directly in front of Clara. "This covers this month," he said. "It does not cover the balance still owed, which, as of today, stands considerably higher than what your ranch is likely worth to anyone but yourself. 30 days, Mrs. Whitfield. Then the bank takes the ranch, and I'll thank you to make the transition as orderly as possible." Clara stared at the notice without touching it, the words swimming for a moment before they settled into meaning. 30 days. 2 barns, a herd of horses, a hillside grave overlooking the pasture Thomas had loved. 30 days, to lose all of it, to a man who had never once set foot on the land he was preparing to take. "I have made every payment," she said again, more quietly now, because there was nothing left to say loudly that would change the numbers in front of her. "You've made most of them," Silas corrected, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "The bank has been patient. The bank is no longer able to afford to be." Clara picked up the notice with a steady hand, though her heart was not steady at all, folded it once, and placed it inside her coat without another word. She turned to leave, chin still level, and it was only as she reached the door that she noticed the man standing near it, a stranger she had not seen enter, dressed plainly in a gray coat, who stepped aside to let her pass and said nothing at all, though his eyes followed the exchange with a stillness that suggested he had missed none of it. Clara did not think of him again that day. She had 30 days, a ranch to save, and no earthly idea, yet, of where the saving might come from. The days after her visit to the bank passed in a blur of arithmetic that never came out right. Clara rode the following morning to Larned, the nearest town of any size with a bank of its own, in the faint hope that another institution might extend her the credit Silas Hargrove had refused to extend. The banker there, a courteous older man named Fitch, listened to her situation with genuine sympathy, examined her ranch's modest but real income from the past year, and told her, with evident regret, that 30 days was simply not enough time for any bank to process a new mortgage, regardless of how sound the underlying business might be. He wished her well, and meant it. It did her no practical good at all, though she thanked him for his honesty, and rode the 2 hours back to Redemption with considerably less hope than she'd carried on the way there. She tried, too, to sell horses faster than she normally would have, riding to 3 neighboring ranches to offer stock, at a price lower than she knew it was worth, simply to raise cash quickly. 2 ranchers bought a horse apiece, sympathetic to her situation but unwilling to overextend their own finances on her behalf, and one, an older widower named Grady who had known Thomas well, offered to buy a 3rd horse at a fair price, rather than the discounted one Clara proposed, quietly refusing to take advantage of her circumstances, even as she pressed him to. It was not nearly enough, any of it. Even added to what little Clara had managed to save over the past 18 months, the total fell well short of what the bank required, and she knew it before she finished counting. Word of the foreclosure notice spread through Redemption within days, the way such news always did, in a town where everyone's business eventually became everyone else's. Some of the sympathy Clara received was genuine and welcome. Mrs. Higgins, who ran the boarding house 2 streets over and had known Clara since her wedding day, brought a basket of preserves and sat with her at the kitchen table for the better part of an afternoon, saying little beyond, "Silas Hargrove has been looking for an excuse to expand that bank's land holdings since the day he took the job, Clara. You're not the first, and you likely won't be the last, but that doesn't make it right. And it doesn't mean you're alone in this." Mrs. Higgins was not exaggerating. It had not escaped the notice of several long-time Redemption families that the Hargrove name had, over the past year, begun appearing rather more frequently on deeds and land transfers than it ever had, before Silas took over the bank's daily management. No one had connected the pattern plainly enough to say so aloud, not yet. But there was a particular quality to the way certain neighbors exchanged glances whenever a foreclosure notice went out. As though each one confirmed a suspicion, nobody had quite worked up the nerve to voice directly. Other reactions were less kind, delivered in the particular, careless way small towns sometimes discussed misfortune that had not yet happened to them personally. A few remarks overheard at the Mercantile about how a ranch that size had always been too much for one woman to manage, as though the mortgage itself were proof of some earlier, more fundamental failure, rather than simple bad timing following a husband's death. Clara bore all of it the way she had learned to bear most things since Thomas died, quietly, and mostly alone, with Amos Riley as her only real confidant through the worst of the days that followed. Amos, for his part, refused to discuss the possibility that the ranch might actually be lost. "We've got 30 days and 2 good hands between us," he told her, more than once. mending fence posts with the same steady rhythm he'd used for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen worse odds turn out fine, and I've seen better odds go bad. Ain't no sense borrowing tomorrow's trouble, when today's got plenty of its own. Clara appreciated his stubbornness more than she let on, though privately, doing the arithmetic late at night by lamplight the way she always did. She could not make his optimism match the numbers in front of her, no matter how many times she tried. The two of them worked longer hours than usual in those weeks, though neither said much about why. Amos took to checking the fences twice a day instead of once, as though sheer diligence might somehow convince the bank to reconsider, and Clara found herself rising earlier each morning, standing in the barn doorway before sunrise, counting the horses the way she had counted them every morning since Thomas died, only now doing the arithmetic of what each one might fetch at auction if it came to that, and hating herself a little for doing it. One morning, Amos found her there before dawn, silent, and simply set a second cup of coffee down beside her without a word, the way he'd done 100 mornings before, and the two of them stood watching the herd in the gray light until there was nothing left to do but start the day's work. One evening, roughly a week into the 30 days, Clara rode up to the small hillside where Thomas was buried, the same as she had done countless times before, when the weight of running the ranch alone grew heavier than she could carry silently. She sat beside the modest stone marker for a long while, watching the horses graze in the pasture below, the same pasture Thomas had chosen for this very spot, because, as he'd told her once, half joking, he wanted to keep an eye on the herd even after he was gone. The wind moved through the grass the way it always did at that hour, and somewhere below, one of the young foals let out a short, impatient whinny that, for just a moment, sounded almost like laughter, and Clara found herself smiling despite everything, the way Thomas always could make her smile even now, even from a hillside grave that had nothing left to say back to her. "I don't know how to save it, Thomas," she admitted quietly, to the stone and the darkening sky. "I've done everything I know how to do, and it isn't enough. 30 days, and I don't know how to make 30 days stretch far enough to matter." She did not cry. She had done most of her crying in the 18 months since his death. But she sat there long enough that the first stars had come out before she gathered herself and rode back down to the ranch house, because there were horses to feed and no one else who was going to do it. She did not know that, several days earlier, a quiet stranger had begun asking careful questions about the Redemption Bank and Trust, and about the widow whose mortgage its ambitious young cashier seemed so determined to call due. Nathaniel Boone had come to Redemption on business entirely unrelated to Clara Whitfield. He held controlling interests in a number of small regional banks across Kansas and Nebraska, quietly acquired over many years as a hedge against his larger cattle and land holdings, and the Redemption Bank and Trust happened to be among them, though he rarely involved himself in its daily operations, trusting local management to run things sensibly. He had built his fortune the way many careful men did on the frontier, not through any single stroke of luck, but through 2 decades of steady, unglamorous decisions, buying land during droughts when no one else wanted it, holding cattle through price collapses that ruined less patient men, and reinvesting nearly everything rather than spending it. He had little patience left after all those years, for men who mistook a position of authority for a license to treat other people carelessly. He had stopped in that particular morning simply to review the branch's quarterly figures with its manager, and had been standing near the entrance, waiting for his appointment, when Silas Hargrove's confrontation with Clara Whitfield unfolded in full view of the lobby. He had said nothing at the time. It was not, strictly speaking, his habit to interfere in the daily decisions of men he'd hired to make exactly those decisions. But something about the particular satisfaction in Silas Hargrove's voice, and the careful dignity with which the widow had absorbed it, had stayed with him in a way that made him postpone his return to Wichita by several days. He asked, quietly and without revealing his interest in the matter, after the true state of the Whitfield mortgage, not from Silas directly, but from the branch's senior clerk, a careful older man named Everett Dunn, who had worked at the bank for over a decade and had no particular loyalty to its newer, more ambitious cashier. Dunn told him, with evident discomfort at discussing bank business so plainly, that the Whitfield account had, in fact, been more consistent than most of the bank's mortgages over the past year and a half, missing only 2 payments out of 18, both explainable by circumstances beyond the widow's control, and that Silas Hargrove's decision to call the note due in 30 days, rather than extend reasonable additional time, was, in Dunn's private opinion, considerably more aggressive than the bank's usual practice. Nathaniel asked, too, around town, at the livery stable, at the mercantile, from anyone willing to talk about the Whitfield ranch, and learned that Clara Whitfield was, by every account, a capable and honest rancher who had kept her small operation running through genuine hardship, and that Silas Hargrove had made no particular secret of his ambition to see the bank's landholdings grow, nor of his belief that a widow's ranch, however well managed, represented an opportunity rather than an obligation. The livery stable owner, an easygoing man named Pruitt, who had sold Thomas Whitfield his first breeding stallion years earlier, spoke of Clara with genuine admiration, noting that she'd bought feed and tack from him regularly through the hardest months, without ever once falling behind on what she owed him personally, which Nathaniel took as a more honest measure of her character than anything a bank ledger could show. Nathaniel Boone said nothing of any of this to anyone in Redemption. He simply listened, considered, and began, quietly, to make arrangements of his own. Nathaniel Boone did not confront Silas Hargrove directly, not yet. He had learned, over many years of managing business interests larger and more complicated than a single small-town bank, that a problem handled quietly and correctly the first time rarely needed to be handled loudly a second time. Instead, he wrote to his own attorney in Wichita, a careful and discreet man named Harlan Voss, who had managed Nathaniel's more sensitive business affairs for the better part of a decade, and instructed him to review, in full, every foreclosure Silas Hargrove had initiated since taking over as cashier of the Redemption branch. The report that came back, within the week, confirmed what Nathaniel had already begun to suspect, that the Whitfield mortgage was not an isolated case of overly aggressive banking, but part of a broader pattern. Silas Hargrove had called in 3 other loans early over the past year, in each case from borrowers with limited means to fight the decision, and had, in every instance, arranged for the resulting land to be sold at auction to buyers connected, in one way or another, to Silas's own family interests outside the bank. It was, Nathaniel reflected, a tidy little scheme, and not an especially original one, a young cashier using his position to quietly transfer land from those least able to defend themselves into hands that would, eventually, benefit him directly. It was also, as it happened, precisely the kind of arrangement that violated the terms under which Nathaniel had entrusted local management with day-to-day authority over the bank in the first place. He did not act immediately to expose Silas. He wanted, first, to be certain the Whitfield ranch itself was protected, regardless of whatever else followed. He instructed Harlan Voss to quietly purchase the Whitfield mortgage note outright, at its full remaining value, from the Redemption Bank and Trust, structured as a standard transfer between financial institutions that would draw no particular attention and require no explanation to Silas Hargrove beyond the ordinary paperwork such transfers required. The transaction was completed within 9 days of the original foreclosure notice, leaving Nathaniel Boone, rather than the Redemption Bank and Trust, as the true holder of the debt against Clara Whitfield's ranch, a fact that existed, for the moment, only on paper filed in a county clerk's office that no one in Redemption had any particular reason to examine. He instructed Voss further to draft new terms for the note, an extended repayment schedule, reduced to reflect what a well-run horse ranch could reasonably be expected to pay, structured to succeed rather than to fail. He did not intend to forgive the debt outright. Clara Whitfield had not asked for charity, had said as much herself in the bank lobby, and Nathaniel Boone respected that position enough to honor it. What he intended, instead, was simply to ensure that a debt fairly owed could be fairly repaid, on terms that did not depend on a young cashier's ambition to seize land. He had no legitimate claim to hurry along. While the paperwork proceeded, Nathaniel made one further inquiry into precisely who among the auction buyers in Silas Hargrove's previous foreclosures had a family connection to the cashier, and how much of that connection could be documented plainly enough to present, if it ever became necessary, in front of witnesses who would understand exactly what they were looking at. Harlan Voss, methodical as ever, produced a tidy set of county land records within days. 3 separate transfers, each one showing a different buyer on paper, but each one, upon closer inspection, tracing back through a chain of small loans and family favors to Silas Hargrove's own brother-in-law, a man who ran a modest freight business in Larned and had, evidently, developed a sudden and unexplained interest in ranch land over the past year. He did not tell Clara Whitfield any of this. He did not introduce himself to her at all in the days that followed, though he passed her once on the road into town and simply nodded, the way any stranger might nod to another traveler, and rode on without stopping. The 30th day arrived on a Thursday, cold and overcast, with a particular gray light that seemed, to Clara, entirely appropriate for the occasion. She had spent the final week making what peace she could with the likely outcome, though she had not stopped working the ranch in the meantime, because horses still needed feeding, regardless of who might own the land beneath their hooves by nightfall. Silas Hargrove arrived at the Whitfield Ranch shortly after 10 o'clock that morning, accompanied by Deputy Cole, whose presence was a formality required by law rather than any expectation of trouble, and by a clerk carrying the paperwork necessary to formally record the bank's seizure of the property. Silas wore his finest coat for the occasion, Clara noted, with the small, bitter observation that a man about to take a widow's home from her had apparently thought it worth dressing well for. Amos had seen the riders coming from a half-mile off, and had already fetched Clara from the barn by the time they reached the gate, the two of them standing together on the porch, the way they had faced most of the ranch's hardships over the past year and a half, side by side, saying little, simply present for whatever came next. Clara stood on the porch as the 3 men approached, Amos beside her, both of them silent, because there was nothing left to say that 30 days of trying had not already said. "Mrs. Whitfield," Silas began, producing a folded document from his coat, with the same unhurried satisfaction he'd shown in the bank lobby a month earlier. "As of today, the Redemption Bank and Trust takes formal possession of—" "I'm afraid that's not quite accurate, Mr. Hargrove." The voice came from behind the small group, and all 4 of them turned to find Nathaniel Boone approaching on horseback, having ridden up the ranch road without any of them noticing his approach. He dismounted unhurried, removed his hat, and walked forward with the same plain, quiet manner Clara remembered from the bank lobby, though she had not thought of him once in the weeks since. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," he said, addressing Silas directly. "Nathaniel Boone. I hold the controlling interest in the Redemption Bank and Trust, among several other institutions in this territory." He paused, letting the words settle the way a careful man lets important words settle. "As of 9 days ago, I also hold the Whitfield mortgage note directly, purchased outright from the bank you currently work for. Which means, Mr. Hargrove, that whatever paper you're holding in your hand right now has no legal standing whatsoever." Silas's confident expression faltered for the first time since the confrontation began. I wasn't informed of any such transfer." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "You weren't. I found that arrangement suited my purposes rather well, given what my attorney's review of your recent foreclosures turned up. 3 other families, Mr. Hargrove, whose land ended up, by a rather remarkable coincidence, in the hands of buyers connected to your own family. I imagine Deputy Cole here would find that paperwork rather interesting reading when he has a free afternoon. Deputy Cole, who had said nothing throughout the exchange, looked considerably less comfortable than he had upon arriving. Silas opened his mouth, closed it again, and seemed, for a long moment, entirely unable to locate whatever words he had planned to use that morning. Mrs. Whitfield's mortgage, Nathaniel continued, turning now to Clara, his tone shifting into something considerably gentler, has been restructured under new terms, a payment schedule that reflects what this ranch can reasonably produce, rather than what a man in a hurry might prefer to collect. The paperwork is with my attorney in Wichita, and copies will reach you within the week. You owe this bank nothing today, and you will owe it nothing tomorrow beyond what you agreed to originally, on terms fair enough that I expect you'll manage them without difficulty. Clara stood very still, absorbing the sudden, disorienting shift from the morning she had braced herself for to the one now unfolding in front of her. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why would you do this?" "Because a debt fairly owed deserves to be fairly collected," Nathaniel said simply. "And because I don't much care for men who use borrowed authority to take what isn't rightfully theirs to take." He glanced once, briefly, at Silas. "I believe Mr. Hargrove and I have some further business to discuss, alone." Amos, standing beside Clara through the entire exchange, let out a low breath that was nearly a laugh, though he had the good sense to keep it quiet. Deputy Cole folded the paperwork he'd been carrying back into his coat without being asked, apparently deciding, wisely, that whatever formal proceedings he'd arrived to witness were no longer required. Silas Hargrove, for his part, said nothing further, though the color had drained entirely from his face by the time Nathaniel finished speaking, and he made no move to argue further, as the two of them walked a short distance from the porch to continue their conversation privately, out of Clara's hearing. Silas Hargrove did not remain the cashier of the Redemption Bank and Trust past the end of that month. What precisely was said in the private conversation between him and Nathaniel Boone, no one in Redemption ever learned in full detail, though it was generally understood, from the considerably humbler man who packed his belongings and left town within the week, that the conversation had not gone in Silas's favor. Everett Dunn, the careful senior clerk who had spoken honestly about the Whitfield account when Nathaniel first asked, found himself promoted to branch manager shortly afterward, a position he filled, by all accounts, with considerably more fairness than his predecessor had shown, reviewing every mortgage on the bank's books personally, to ensure none of them carried the same quiet unfairness the Whitfield note nearly had. Clara Whitfield kept her ranch. The new payment schedule proved, exactly as Nathaniel had predicted, entirely manageable for a well-run operation, no longer racing against an artificial deadline, and within 2 years, the Whitfield horse ranch had grown to nearly double the herd it carried the year Thomas died, with Amos Riley still minding the horses alongside her, exactly as he'd promised he would. Mrs. Higgins liked to say, whenever the subject came up over coffee, that she had never in her life seen a woman work harder to prove a bank wrong, and that Clara Whitfield had earned every last acre of that ranch twice over, once when she and Thomas built it together, and again when she refused to let it be taken from her afterward. She kept, on the mantel above her hearth, a small wooden horse that Thomas had carved for her the winter before he died, unfinished at the time of his death, and completed, in the months after, by Clara herself, teaching her own hands the careful work he had never gotten to teach her directly. Beside it, in a small frame, she kept the original foreclosure notice Silas Hargrove had placed in her hands that morning at the bank. Not out of bitterness, she would explain to anyone who asked, but as a reminder of exactly how close she had come to losing everything, and exactly how much difference one quiet, watchful stranger had made in a story that could easily have ended very differently. She had learned, too, that no one truly manages anything entirely alone. Not really. That even the most stubbornly independent widow in Redemption had needed an aging hired hand who refused to quit, a boarding house owner who brought preserves and honest words in equal measure, and, in the end, a stranger who happened to be standing near a door at exactly the right moment. Nathaniel Boone continued to hold his interest in the Redemption Bank and Trust for many years afterward, though he visited the branch only rarely, content to let Everett Dunn manage its daily affairs with the fairness he'd shown from the beginning. When he did visit Redemption, he made a point of riding out to the Whitfield Ranch, ostensibly to check on an investment that had, by any honest measure, proven a sound one, though the conversations over coffee at Clara's kitchen table tended to last considerably longer than any discussion of mortgage terms required. Whether the people of Redemption ever fully understood the true nature of that particular friendship, neither Clara nor Nathaniel ever felt any pressing need to clarify. Some things, Clara had come to believe, needed no explanation beyond the quiet, steady fact of them continuing, month after month, exactly as they were. That's where we'll leave Clara Whitfield, her ranch safely her own, and the quiet stranger who turned out to hold far more power than anyone in that bank lobby ever guessed, and who chose, when it mattered most, to use it quietly rather than loudly. If you were listening today while you had your hands busy with something else, chores of your own maybe, or a quiet afternoon on the porch, I'd love to know what you were doing while this story kept you company. Tell me down in the comments, and if you don't mind sharing, I'd love to know what part of the world you're joining us from today. It always means more than you'd think, hearing how far these stories travel. If stories about quiet strength, and about people who turn out to be far more than they first appear, are the kind that speak to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. And if today's story was worth your time, a like helps this small channel more than you might expect. Thank you, truly, for riding along with me today. Until the next trail.